Okay, I'll just wait for the stream to come up. There we are. Okay. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back. Welcome also to all the students who are attending this satsang online. We have a lot of questions, especially from online students. We'll also take questions from our local students, as we usually do. We'll go back and forth. Let's start with some online questions. First is from Vishaka, who lives in Virginia. She asks about the practice of nididhyasana, and just a little explanation is that nididhyasana is a practice of contemplation used for the sake of assimilating what you have already come to understand through the teachings of Vedanta. For example, you come to understand that you are conscious. As pure consciousness, nothing can affect you. Not your body, not your mind, not anything out there in the world. But then to contemplate on that in you, and that contemplation is usually done preceded by meditation. First, meditation is practiced to quiet and prepare the mind, and then this practice of nididhyasana is performed. Vishaka then asks, can nididhyasana only be practiced during meditation, or are there other ways to achieve it? So, it's a nice question. I'm going to turn that off until we're using it. All right. First of all, nididhyasana is not an introductory practice. It's an advanced practice. Nididhyasana is a practice when you've already discovered your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. And the reason for that is you can only contemplate on what you know. You can't contemplate on what you don't know. So in this way it is, as I said, it's for the sake of assimilation. And it's usually practiced in a formal way after meditation. By the way, we will be resuming our advanced meditation sessions, which will meet one Wednesday a month. It'll be on the third Wednesday of each month. So starting the third Wednesday of this month, we will resume. And it'll mostly be nididhyasana in that class. So if you don't know what it is or how it's practiced, then please come and join us. And for all of our online students, yes, those sessions will be available online, so you'll be able to practice that as well. There is a way to practice nididhyasana throughout. Now, I won't say throughout the day. There's an important application of nididhyasana that can be performed while you're engaged in activities in particular. Let me just give a very specific example. I can't think of any better way to explain it. Suppose you've already discovered, I am unchanging consciousness. And unchanging consciousness doesn't get affected by anything. Suppose you've discovered that. And when I say discover, I don't mean understand it. I mean, what I do mean is you've discovered that me, the consciousness who knows what's happening right now, that consciousness, which is my essential nature, is unchanging, therefore unaffected. Having discovered that during some class situation, then suppose you're at work and your boss is in a bad mood and you get it. The boss lays into you, as they say in American English, and Suppose you get a little upset. Now, of course, getting upset is normal, and someone who has not been exposed to Vedanta might get quite upset, and who knows what the outcome would be. But someone who has really been deeply engaged with these teachings, someone who has discovered that I am unchanging consciousness, utterly unaffected, that person still has habitual identification with the body and mind. And that habitual identification is what is handled through nididhyasana. So this person that I'm describing is someone who is enlightened, but their enlightenment has not been fully assimilated. So when our enlightened person goes to work and gets in trouble with the boss scolds the employee, and that person, because of the habitual identification with the body and mind, might have some emotional reaction. But immediately after that, usually it's just a few moments of emotional reaction. Everyone is different. Let me just describe it how I used to experience this. And that is, there would be a few moments of emotional reaction, and then the thought would come, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Why is this even happening? The boss has a reason to be angry, and so why should I make such a big deal of it? So it's just a situation. It's a normal situation, and it's a situation that doesn't affect the essence of who I am, consciousness. That moment of reflection can take place while your boss continues to scold you. This was my experience years ago, that it would take just a few moments for that to kick in. And that is an example of nididhyasana, because you are engaged. It's an example of nididhyasana not at the time of meditation, but while you're engaged in day-to-day activities. And in this case, I should now elaborate a little bit on one point. I said, for me, it would kick in after a few moments. It varies tremendously from person to person. For some, it might be when you get home and then you're thinking about the day, or when you're laying in bed waiting to fall asleep at night, or next morning when you're taking a nice hot shower. But if it's really gone in that you are Satchidananda Atma, if you've personally discovered that truth, eventually you will come to reflect on your emotional reaction to your boss's scolding. You'll come to reflect on it and realize it was unnecessary to have those emotions of hurt or frustration or anger or whatever. This comes after the fact. So it might come the next day, it might come at the end of the day, after an hour. In my case, it was after a few moments. And eventually, the gap between saying, wait a minute, the gap between being scolded and saying, wait a minute, gets shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, until finally, as your boss starts scolding, you get it already. And therefore, there's no emotional reaction. What I've just described is the process of assimilation. Every person who gains this wisdom in a personal way realizes that I am unchanging consciousness. Every person will continue to have this habitual identification. Our minds are highly habitual. It's the way the mind and brain works. So it takes time to gradually reduce that habitual identification with the body and mind. And that's why you react. If you weren't identified with your body and mind in the first place, the boss is shouting, but not shouting at you. Why should you react? If you are fully established in your knowledge that I am unchanging consciousness, the boss is shouting, let him shout. Although you might feel bad for your boss, after all, he has a blood pressure problem, and this is only making his blood pressure go up. The point is that if you are fully established in your true nature, they call it atmanishta, being completely established in your true nature, then there's not even a momentary reaction. But it takes time to remove the habitual identification to arrive at that kind of nishtha, that kind of being firmly established. And that's the purpose of nididhyasana. That nididhyasana can be done in a formal meditative way, as we'll do on the Wednesday advanced meditation sessions, and then, as I've just discussed, it can be done during your daily activities, and especially when, just a little bit more. Again, this is an advanced practice, but such a crucial one that every single time you feel an emotional reaction, again, this is for someone who's already discovered, I am unchanging consciousness. Having made that discovery, then following that discovery, every single time you feel threatened, it becomes a habit. Again, I'm just describing my own experience. It became a habit for me. Every time I felt that little twinge, you feel threatened, or you feel hurt, or you feel frustrated. Every time I would take that as an opportunity for nididhyasana. And that went on for years and had a very significant effect. Okay, next question from Kartik in India. In Vedanta, we're taught to let go of desires to achieve liberation. However, I wonder how this principle applies to individuals like scientists or innovators whose work seems driven by strong aspirations. And it's certainly true in any field. Someone who's most driven makes the most progress. There's no question. If you are very complacent in your profession, it will absolutely reduce the progress you make. That's just that's a fact of life. But the confusion here is to think that being highly motivated is only driven by desire. Now, our definition of desire is important. In fact, we make a distinction between two kinds of desire, binding desire and non-binding desire. And we define a binding desire as one whose non-fulfillment makes you suffer. Suppose you have a non-binding desire, one whose non-fulfillment doesn't make you suffer. No problem, right? So if you want it and you can't have it, and you think, okay, then where's the problem? There's no problem. So the problem of, by the way, it's still a desire, right? I give the example. You'll enjoy this example. The difference between a binding and non-binding desire. I made up this story long ago. A toddler, or maybe 3-4-year-old, is breakfast and old enough now to go to the cabinet and get a box of cereal and do all of this stuff. So this little child goes to the cabinet, opens it up. There are 10 boxes of cereal there, but there are no Fruit Loops. And this child had her heart set on having Fruit Loops. So 10 boxes are there, no Fruit Loops, And she melts down. Mom! Where are the Fruit Loops? And she ends up crying in all of this. Obviously, a binding desire. Suppose mom goes for breakfast, and mom also wants Fruit Loops. No, she can like Fruit Loops, what to say. 10 boxes are there, no Fruit Loops. So she just grabs another box. She wanted the Fruit Loops, but she wasn't disappointed by the absence of Fruit Loops. That's a very simple illustration of the difference between a binding and a non-binding desire. When Vedanta says you shouldn't have desires, not shouldn't, but Vedanta says desire is a source of suffering. For the sake of freedom from suffering, you have to be free from desires. Which kind? Binding desires. Is it possible to be highly driven in your profession, but having it be a non-binding desire? You say, well, I'm going to try to be the head of my department. And after 5 years, if you get it, good. After 5 years, if you don't get it, if it was a non-binding desire, okay. I'll keep trying, or maybe it's time to go get another work for a different company. This company isn't appreciating my efforts, my talents, so let me try elsewhere. That would be how about an enlightened corporation person, corporate climber, whoever. Anyway, not likely perhaps, but you get my point, and that is being driven for success need not be based on a binding desire. You can be driven, of course we're talking, the thrust of this discussion so far is for an enlightened person, and definitely an enlightened person won't have any binding desires, but still might be highly motivated to be successful in some endeavor. But suppose someone is not yet enlightened. Then how to be highly driven and not let it be a binding desire? And that's the purpose of karma yoga. If you are driven not for success, but you are driven as a karma yogi to do the absolute best you can at everything you do and dedicate your work to Ishvara, it's all part of your spiritual practice. So that karma yogi also can be highly driven without being without binding desires. Okay, next question from Cody. Cody asks, enlightenment happens in the mind, correct? Does it mean that an enlightened person can lose that enlightenment if he or she has Alzheimer's or some other brain disease? So we define enlightenment as, in general, as a removal of ignorance, and more specifically, as removing the habitual identification with the body and mind. So that when you think about yourself, well, this is a nice way of putting it. When you think about yourself, you don't think about your body and mind. You think pure consciousness. That's enlightenment. The habitual identification has been broken. So suppose that person who whenever they use the word I, that I ultimately refers to their true nature as pure consciousness. If that person has some brain, by the way, brain injuries can do this also. So many people suffer from brain injury in addition to Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia. So there are many things that can affect our brains and minds. What does that do to enlightenment? Well, it's you think about it. When you have removed habitual identification with your body and mind, once a habit is removed completely, it won't come back, right? Why would it come back? Why would dementia or a brain injury cause a reversal of your thinking? The way that thinking has been long since removed through your practice of nididhyasana. So it would not be the case that dementia or brain injury would cause that identification to return. But everything we experience is still through the brain. If the brain and mind, if the brain is damaged, if the mind doesn't work properly, that's absolutely going to affect your experience. It won't affect your enlightenment. Most certainly will affect your experience. Memory goes. All different things happen for people. In brain injury or stroke, some people lose faculties. You can't speak, you can't walk, etc. That's all possible. So it is not the case that that enlightenment is lost, but certainly the function of your brain and mind absolutely would get lost. Okay, we'll take one more question here, and then we'll take some local questions. This question is from Jay in New York, and Jay asks, how can I say I am all-pervasive consciousness if the one making the claim is my mind and not consciousness? Wouldn't it be more correct to say I am a mind that exists within consciousness? I am a mind? That doesn't work at all. And the confusion here for Jay and for many people is we forget that I is a pronoun. And we talked about this in an earlier class. And that is, I represent something. What does I represent? When you use the word, let me illustrate the function of pronouns. If I tell you, bring that to me, what is that? I better specify what that is, because that is a pronoun, a third-person pronoun. So pronouns refer to something, and we better be clear about what they refer to. So if you use the word pronoun, if you use the pronoun I, to what does it refer? Suppose I say, I am Swami Tadatmananda. That I is referring to this living thing sitting in this chair. That I is not referring to Satchidananda Atma. But suppose I say, I am unchanging consciousness. I can say that. It's true. Notice in that case, I does not refer to this individual blob of flesh sitting in this chair. It now refers to my true nature as Satchidananda Atma. So whenever we use the word I, we should pay attention to the fact that it is a pronoun and it means different things in different situations. So coming back to Jay's question, how can I say I am all-pervasive consciousness if the one making the claim is in my mind? Well, it simply means that you have, for that moment when you say I am all-pervasive consciousness, that I is referring to your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. Now, that statement happens to arise in your mind. That's a fact. Every idea, every statement arises in your mind. Well, arising in your mind is a pronoun I. To what does that pronoun I refer? So it's really a problem. What a silly way of putting it. It's a problem with pronouns, but a serious one. What does I refer to? And just to show you the consequence of this analysis, if you say, I am suffering, what I are you referring to? Who suffers? After all, consciousness, the consciousness which is the essence of who you are, that consciousness reveals the presence of suffering. So when you say, I suffer, there's a lot of confusion going on. Who suffers? Does the body suffer? Not exactly. Does the mind suffer? Sort of, but really speaking, you don't say my body suffers. You know, who says my mind is suffering? We all say I suffer. Who is that I? And this is a very complicated topic, because that I is a complicated thing. By the way, are you as an individual person, are you simple or complex? Right? We are all incredibly complex. So many dimensions to who we are at every level, at a physical level, at a social level, at a psychological, emotional level, at every level. Tremendous complexity. Well, the I who says I suffer is equally complex. That I ultimately, that I includes several factors. One factor which is crucial is consciousness, because fundamentally speaking, you are a conscious being. Simply put, no one can refute that. I am a conscious being. But when you are a conscious being identified with the body and mind, then you become the one who says, I suffer. So who is it that suffers? We use the word jiva, and the word jiva then refers to a complex entity, an entity that includes consciousness, but also includes body and mind, because of the presence of identification with that body and mind. So it's tricky. Okay, do we have some questions here? Okay, a question here. You'll need the microphone.
So one was a comment of the question that was about losing the enlightenment of somebody with brain injury or Alzheimer's. So being in the field of treating this, I explain it by a detachment and attachment. So in enlightenment, we are doing the detachment of the BMI, but we are doing the attachment to the self, the real self. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Alzheimer's and other brain injury, both the factors are dropped. The detachment is also gone, and the attachment is also gone. So as a result, yes, the enlightenment is lost, because both those fields are lost. That's what I understood.
Yeah. There's a little problem with saying that, and that is what you call attachment, or identification and disidentification might be more accurate, since attachment has so many other meanings. So to identify yourself as Satchidananda Atma and to disidentify yourself from the body and mind is what we mean by enlightenment. But tell me, is this identification central in our moment-to-moment experience. And what I mean to say is, when you look in the mirror, wrong example. When you wake up in the morning, do you have to deliberately identify with your body and mind before you get out of bed?
No.
Natural. It's already there. So an enlightened person then doesn't need to deliberately identify with Satchit Ananda Atma. There's no deliberate act of identification for that enlightened person. However, what you said about the loss of mental function, that's what it is. So instead of saying loss of enlightenment, I think it's more accurate to say loss of mental function, which affects experience. And enlightenment is something that's, to talk about it, enlightenment as getting lost, anyway, it just seems more intuitive to me to say loss of mental function rather than loss of enlightenment. You had another question?
So the question I had was to understand the ananda-maya kosha a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That layer of ananda-maya, they also say it's something to do with maya and ignorance. I don't know exactly how you feel close to that ananda-maya kosha.
Okay. Good. That's a good question. And to answer it, first of all, you used the word layer, which is a common translation of kosha, and they're not layers. And you've all seen the picture of Atma as that little dot, then surrounded by 5 layers, which is a silly diagram, because Atma's a little dot in the middle. Atma has no edge or boundary or dimension. So how can Atma be encircled? How can Atma be covered? Kosha means cover, not...
Sheath, yeah.
So how can Atma be covered? Can't. Atma is all pervasive. Can't be covered. Which is why commentators always say koshavat. It is as though a covering. And here's a more accurate way of understanding the 5 koshas, and then we'll come to address your question about ananda-maya kosha. Kosha, as understood by Shankaracharya, is a locus of identification. That's a very specific. By the way, I have a whole video on this. If you have any questions about koshas, start with that video. It might be very helpful. Let's start here. When you are identified with your body, physical body, ananda-maya. Maya means made of. So that which is made of a lot of that. Anna means food. So ananda-maya kosha then is a locus of identification. It can't cover Atma, but rather you get identified with that kosha, with that ananda-maya kosha. Similarly, pranamaya kosha can't cover Atma, it's all pervasive. But you get identified when you say, I'm so tired. You're identified with pranamaya kosha. Manomaya kosha, I'm very happy, I'm very sad. You're identified with manomaya kosha. Vijnanamaya kosha, I can't figure out this problem. Or eureka, I've got it. Vijnanamaya kosha, intellect. Now notice that the covering is figurative, because what it means is instead of identifying with your true self, you're identifying with something external. external. This is where the layers come in. The layer is not a good translation, but the idea is that it's something external. So we have 5 groups of external attributes with which we get identified, and then they're called koshas. So I think locus of identification would be a very precise way to speak about these 5 koshas. Then we come to ananda-maya kosha. Ananda-maya kosha, the kosha made of ananda, that so-called bliss sheath, its identification with that. The best way to understand it is in deep sleep. In deep sleep, it's such a blissful condition. How do you like it when someone comes and shouts at you, "Hey, wake up!" And you're in this blissful sleep, and someone's shouting, or your phone, going beep, 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 whatever, your alarm goes off, whatever. And you would rather remain in that condition of blissful sleep, because you are identified with that blissful condition. The ananda, which is what remains when the mind becomes quiet, what remains is that ananda. You get identified with that ananda, and therefore you enjoy that blissful condition. You might not want to come out of that blissful condition. So in that sense, the ananda-maya kosha is one more locus of identification. I'm not sure, has that answered your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think and just in general, if we're going to talk about 5 koshas, this is a very misunderstood topic in Advaita Vedanta, beginning with that dot in the middle with 5 circles around it. Atma is not a little dot. Give me a break. Atma is all pervasive. How can you represent Atma as that little dot? In fact, when I've drawn this diagram on the board, I omit the dot. And then they say, where's Atma? Atma's a board. You don't need a little dot to represent Atma. Atma is everything. Everything is in consciousness. Everything is in Atma. So your body is in consciousness. Your pranamaya kosha is in consciousness. Manomaya, vijnanamaya, ananda-maya, it's all in consciousness. So it's not that consciousness is in the middle of the 5 koshas, but rather the 5 koshas is in consciousness. We've just flipped it inside out. And this shows how the conventional understanding is a common problem. There's a question back here. You'll need the microphone.
So in the last class, as in the previous class, you know how you were discussing how the elements, like modern science now shows that there's more than 5 elements, whereas the scriptures say otherwise. The fact that there is a discrepancy doesn't then, like, who's to say that the other half of the Vedas also don't have like, it's not fully. I guess you can go back to the Shruti, Yukti, and Abhava part. Okay.
Well, that was the difference. In fact, that was a technical subject that I chose not to discuss. So since you're bringing it up, I'll get into that technical subject. And that is, we need to understand, and the reason why I didn't take it up in class, and I tried to sidestep the question, and you won't let me sidestep the question, is because it's a question about hermeneutics. You say, what? What in the world is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is the precise method of scriptural interpretation. In other words, you can't interpret the scripture any way you want. in spite of the fact that most people do exactly that. There are principles and rules for scriptural interpretation. Every statement in the Veda can be analyzed according to its purpose, its intent. So, suppose we take a statement in the Veda that says the world is made of 5 elements. What is the purpose or intent of that statement? Well, that statement is found in the Karmakanda first, and that statement is said to help you navigate the world in which you're supposed to perform rituals, since the early part of the Veda is focused on the performance of rituals. I'm getting so much noise here today. So that statement that says the world is made of 5 elements, the intent of that statement is not to teach you about the world. The intent of that statement is to help you function in the world and perform these rituals. So that's why the word that we saw in Shankara's text was anuvada, a restatement of conventional wisdom. So the statements have to be understood according to this rule. There are rules of interpretation, and a major rule of hermeneutics is that a statement has to be understood according to its intent. So when the scripture says the world is made of 5 elements, the scripture does not say that to provide you with definitive information about the world. That's not the intent. It's anuvada. It's a restatement of conventional wisdom. When the scripture says your true nature is Brahman, what is the intent? In that case, the intent is very different. The intent is to address you and help you understand the truth of who you are, your essential nature as Satchidananda Atma. So this principle of interpreting a scripture according to the intent of each statement is what sets those 2 kinds of things aside. So therefore, and just to finish the topic, when science says there are 92 naturally occurring elements and a bunch created in laboratories, what is the intent? The intent is to definitively define what the world is made of. So that's a completely different intent than the Veda has when it says there are 5 elements. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good. Other questions here? You'll need the microphone.
So there are 2 questions, but they are related, so it might actually be one question. But how to deal with regret and how to wish that things, how to not wish that things be different than they are.
Okay, good question. Of course, these questions are more of a psychological nature, how to deal with regret. But we can certainly take a Vedantic look at these issues. The first one, how to deal with regret, really is a purely psychological issue. So regret is an emotion. And the purpose of Vedanta is not to address our emotions. In fact, Vedanta presumes that you've already dealt with your emotions before you've undertaken the spiritual path. It's presumed that you are a prepared student. In practice, no one as a prepared student. So we all do the best we can, but it means that we have to deal with psychological problems at their own level. We can't look for spiritual solutions to psychological problems, which is a very common mistake. Someone who's sad and miserable says, oh, let me try this Advaita Vedanta. It doesn't work. Vedanta doesn't address sadness. It doesn't address, well, it's a little more complicated than that. Doesn't address, we'll just stay with regret. So regret is an emotional problem, and as such, it should be handled at its own level. A psychological problem requires a psychological solution. So what is the solution to the problem of regret depends on who you ask. So if you ask a therapist who practices CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, the therapist would say, your regret is based on a false assumption. The false assumption that you shouldn't make mistakes, but every single human being makes mistakes. Is there anyone here? Anyone's going to say, I've never made a Who would say that? So we've all made mistakes. We've all made terrible mistakes. Mistakes with terrible consequences. And is that natural or unnatural? God made us like that. What can we do? We can do the best we can. Can we be perfect? Can we never make another mistake for the rest of our lives? No, we got some years left, which is opportunity to make lots of mistakes. We will. So, this is the approach of cognitive behavioral therapy, is to show how regret is an emotion based on a false belief. Now, if you ask a different therapist, they'll have a different solution to the problem. But in each case, it is an emotional solution for an emotional problem. The second thing you said is actually very Vedantic, to accept things exactly as they are. No psychology will empower you to do that. When your beloved mother or father is dying a painful death due to cancer, you just and can you imagine a self-help book telling you, or a therapist, you just have to accept it as it is? Not possible. Not possible at all. So at that level, to accept reality as it is, there is no psychological solution. That's a spiritual problem. Regret is a psychological problem, requires a psychological solution. Acceptance of reality exactly as it is not a psychological problem. It's a fundamental, existential problem, and it requires a spiritual solution. And the solution is, it's a big problem, big solution. The problem is that we think that our well-being is dependent on external factors, which is an absolutely normal conclusion, but normal doesn't necessarily mean wise. There's wise and there's otherwise, as my guru liked to joke. So normal is otherwise. So to assume that in order for me to be happy, I need this, that, and that. That's an assumption. And it turns out to be a false assumption. And to analyze why it's a false assumption and to come to recognize that my true nature as consciousness doesn't need anything. Consciousness in and of itself is already full and complete. You don't add anything to it. There's a lot of Vedanta behind this. Let me just hint at it through a very simple kind of thought experiment. Suppose you sit down to meditate. When you sit down, you've got a world of problems with you. You're weighed down by all these problems. They've been with you for years. More problems lie ahead. So here we are at the beginning of the new year. And the new year holds many wonderful things. The new year also holds many problems ahead. Both are true. So you sit down to meditate, and all of this stuff is in your head, and you're confused, and you're annoyed, and irritated, frustrated, angry, whatever it is. You're certainly not happy. As you perform your meditation technique, your mind becomes increasingly quiet. In other words, all of those worries and concerns and all of that, all those problems, they just start to fade away. And as they fade away, you start to feel better. The more they fade away, the better you feel. And when your mind is perfectly silent, how would you feel? That's perfect contentment, perfect peace. When your mind is perfectly still. When your mind is perfectly still, what did you get from outside to make you feel so good? Notice it's the other way around. Detaching from what's outside, because what the true source of that perfect peace and contentment, as you already know, it's here. It's not there. So this thought experiment about meditation suggests that you can discover, in very simple language, you can discover that your true nature, your essence of who you are as a conscious being, is okay no matter what. I like this simple language. If you discover, and again, not conceptually understand, but to personally discover that you are okay no matter what, with that discovery, I am okay no matter what, then and only then can you accept reality as it is. Because generally, we make mental demands. I just play with this just for a moment. It's a little silly when you think about it. You know, when a 2-year-old is told, Mom says, you've already had 3 cookies, no more, and the 2-year-old melts down and cries and screams and all of this stuff. Everyone's like that 2-year-old, because we want reality to conform to our expectations. Just like the 2-year-old. The 2-year-old wants it her way. We want it our way. Mother is dying of cancer. She shouldn't die of cancer. Why is this happening? Blah, 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 blah. Wait a minute. I want it my way. Everyone else is subject to, or if you're diagnosed, everyone else is subject to death. If you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, why me? What do you mean? You should be exempt to the laws of nature? But this is how we are at an emotional level. Like a 2-year-old. We want reality to conform to our expectations, like the 2-year-old, and that's because we have this wrong assumption that our well-being depends on so many external factors. Does that address your question? Okay, let's take some more online questions here. Next question from Sri Kumar, who lives in Boston. He talks about health, dizziness. He makes reference. Our last satsang was canceled, and we've canceled several classes over the months because I have a problem with chronic dizziness. Since many of you are concerned, let me just very briefly say that there are two different kinds of dizziness. Some they call peripheral cause, which is in the inner ear, and there's also a central dizziness, which is due to the brain, in particular the brain stem. And I got the jackpot, I got both. And I am under the treatment of a neurologist who specializes in dizziness, but a lot of problems just don't go away. So it's a matter of managing it. None of it is life-threatening, none of it is severe, but there are days when I wake up in the morning and I'm too dizzy to do anything. So today, obviously, is not the case, but there are days like that. Anyway, so Krishna asks about the dizziness, and that's what it is in short. My question today is regarding doership, being an agent of action. At an intellectual level, for the unenlightened person, scriptures teach that we are Brahman, we are the witness. Then who is it that does anything in vyavaharika satta in the world? Who is it that has raga, dvesha? And Krishna's question is a question that everyone asks, and we make things complicated. Vedanta is not, in my opinion, the essence of Vedanta is not complicated, but we're all really good, and I include myself, we're really good at making simple things complicated. And this is a good example. When it says, who is it? I just lost the question. Where's the question? There it is. Who is it that does anything? When you say, I did it, let's just analyze your experience. It's common sense. Can you, let's say, who is it that drives my car? We'll be very specific. Who drives? Can you drive without a body? Hands? Some people do, by the way. If they've lost their limbs, you can drive with your feet. But you need a body, obviously. So, does your body drive? Not without a mind. Does your mind drive? Not without eyes. So you need senses. Does your body, mind, and senses drive? Not if there's no, if you're unconscious. So you have body, mind, and senses, but you're unconscious. Can you drive? So who is it that drives? It's the one who has all these faculties. You have a body, you have a mind, you have senses, and you are a conscious being. All of these factors together are the individual who's engaged in action. So simple, just look at it, best to look at it in a very experiential way, experience-based way. All of these factors are required. Next question from Gordon, who lives in Glasgow. He asks, if I've had infinite number of births, why haven't I not already achieved enlightenment? I'm paraphrasing a little bit. That's a good question. In an infinite number of prior lives, certainly in one of those lives I should have had a good teacher and a good mind and an opportunity to gain enlightenment. Why have I not yet gained enlightenment if I've had an infinite number of prior lives? First of all, infinite number of prior lives is part of the doctrine of karma. The doctrine of karma is a collection of beliefs, none of which is proved, none of which can be disproved. It's a complicated but well-based belief system. And in order to make that belief system work, there have to be an infinite number of prior lives. It's actually an assumption or an inference. It's like in modern cosmology, they can't explain how the universe is working the way it is. It's expanding rather than contracting. So it says, well, there must be such a thing as dark energy. You realize, of course, that dark energy is a concept they made up. There is no such thing as dark energy. They invented the concept of dark energy because it solves a mathematical problem. In the same way, infinite number of prior lives is a concept that's invented to make the doctrine of karma work. Why? If you've had a finite, look at this, if you've had a finite number of lives, it means you've had a first life, right? How did you get born the first time? If you're born due to karma, how did you get born the first time? So there's a logical problem there. And the way we solve the logical problem is to posit an infinite number of prior lives. It's not a fact. It's part of the doctrine of karma. So why have we not... So ignore infinite number of lifetimes. So then we say, why are we not enlightened now? Instead, just ignoring the infinite number of prior lifetimes, we can say, why are we not enlightened now? And that's not hard to answer. Yeah. We don't even need to discuss it. But he then goes on to say, how can, if there have been an infinite number of prior lives, how can an infinite process come to an end? And this is an interesting question. If, according to the doctrine of karma, from the standpoint of the doctrine of karma, how can we explain that this infinite series of lives can have an end? In logic, anything that has a beginning has an end. That which has no beginning should have no end. Just logic. That which has a beginning necessarily has an end. Why? Because if it begins here, this beginning is the end of a prior condition. The very fact that there's a beginning means a change of state, so that it can change state. If it can change from non-existent to existent, then it's capable of changing from existent to non-existent. So beginning implies end, but then conversely, no beginning seems to imply no end. So if you've had an infinite number of lives, there was no first life, so beginningless. How can something beginningless have an end? The answer has to do with the nature of ignorance. And this is one of the really tricky problems in Advaita Vedanta. In fact, in any system of thought, understanding the nature of ignorance and the effects of ignorance. And let me just see if we want to go on. Okay. We'll just, after this, just one more question, and then we'll wrap up for today. So look at this. Everything that has a beginning has an end. That which has no beginning, logically speaking, should have no end. There's an exception, and the exception happens to be ignorance. When does ignorance begin? Now, there's a problem with that. If ignorance begins, it was preceded by another state. And the state should be a state of not being ignorant, which means a state of knowledge. So how do you have a state of knowledge preceding a state of ignorance? Doesn't make any sense. So we have to conclude that ignorance has no beginning. That's logic in terms of common experience. Are you born knowledgeable or are you born ignorant? That's pretty simple way of understanding it as well. So we're born in ignorance, and if there have been an infinite number of prior lives, you can some kind of ignorance has, and especially ignorance of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. In fact, let's narrow our discussion right now. Not ignorance in general, but ignorance of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. We can definitely conclude that that ignorance is beginningless. If you had gotten that knowledge in a prior life and destroyed the ignorance about Satchidananda Atma, then you'd be enlightened, and according to the doctrine of karma, you won't get reborn. So the fact that we sit here today, from the standpoint of the doctrine of karma, is proof that we have had ignorance for an infinite number of prior lives. We have been ignorant of one of our true nature as Satchidananda Atma. So that ignorance of your true nature is beginningless. Can ignorance end? Obviously. Well, wait a minute, we just said anything that has no beginning has no end. Ignorance is an obvious exception to that logical principle, and it shows the mystery of ignorance. Ignorance, actually I think we won't continue. Let me continue with this just for a few more minutes and we'll wrap up. We forget how powerful ignorance is. What would it take? Suppose you went into a laboratory with a bunch of fibers twisted into a long, thin strand. And in the laboratory, you're supposed to turn that bundle of fibers into a snake. You get the reference? Our Vedantic rope snake. So I'm describing a rope. In a laboratory, could you convert a rope into a snake? But in a dark alley, there's a snake. Ignorance is pretty powerful. And if you say, how did ignorance turn the rope into a snake? It's a little mysterious also, which is suggested by the semi-darkness. So ignorance by nature is, they use this fancy word, inscrutable. And inscrutable, here's a way to understand it. If ignorance is represented by darkness, and you want to understand ignorance, and if ignorance is like darkness, then at night, to understand darkness, you take your flashlight, your torch, as you would say, and you go outside looking for that darkness. You want to understand what is darkness with your flashlight. Huh? I'm just suggesting how ignorance is a very strange thing. It has the power to convert rope into snake. It has a beginning. It has no beginning, and it has an end. And it's impossible to determine the nature of ignorance, because as soon as you look at it with your flashlight, it goes away. As soon as you look at ignorance with your intellect destroys the very ignorance you're trying to understand. So ignorance is one of those mysteries of life that really boggle our minds. So anyway, just something to reflect on. I think it's a good time to conclude our session. I'm sorry not able to get to all the questions. A lot of nice questions. We'll set them aside. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah sarve santu niramayaha sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya Mrityorma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat. See you next time.